Shalom, Boker Tov, et Toda. Thank you very much, Vice President Davis. I'm looking forward to your introductions. You always surprise me. I'm also grateful to IDC, ICT, and especially to Dean Boisganor for inviting me to this, what I call Real Summit, where you meet with the real expert, where you are confronted with a gold mine of experience, expertise, and know-how, and where you get inspired in a minimum of time. I hope that with my speech, keynote speech, I will also be able to at least inspire you a little bit. Understand the present, prepare for the future. Every single day we wonder at the United Nations, what is the threat of terrorism? How are we going to tackle it? Who is going to tackle it? Why and when? When listening to Dean Boisganor, he already mentioned a few of the trends, developments, and exactly a fortnight ago, USG Voronkov, head of OCT, and myself presented the 9th report of the Secretary General on Daesh and ISIL. And we started to say the threat is global, the threat is serious, the threat is certainly not over, especially Daesh and ISIL, in spite of the military defeat that remains. A global covert network with a central command is still having the right funding and is alive and kicking, and is certainly making use of new technologies and ICT. Furthermore, we referred to the foreign terrorist fighters returning, relocating, and transiting, and posing, because of the numbers, because of the different categories. We're talking about women, men, boys, and girls-specific challenges in the respective member states. More than 100 states sent their sons and daughters to the conflict zones in the years 2013, 14, and 15. And now some of them are returning, not all with terrorist intent, but some with terrorist intent, deeply involved in the recruitment and incitement, and certainly directing or inspiring other terrorist attacks of those who never left their territory. So that becomes a real complex issue as such. But also the detention in camps, IDP camps, in all kinds of refugee camps in the conflict zones, where we see that children are being separated from their mothers, that mothers are being taken in detention without fair trial and criminal proceedings. We have been alluding to that in our report, saying that it's the member states' responsibility to look at those different situations on a case-by-case basis and to look after different possible measures such as repatriation, protection, assistance, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration. I just alluded to it. Financing of terrorism is something that keeps us awake during night because since all the Security Council resolutions, starting with 1373 till now, the latest 24A62, we see that we didn't manage to get away the funding, the financing of terrorism, including for the funding of ISIL and Daesh. And finally, we also see that there is a clear link between organized crime and terrorism, and that only focusing on terrorist group and not focusing on criminal groups and making the distinction in the investigation and prosecution might also hamper good results. At the end of our report, we said, for all this kind of problems, we need a holistic, a comprehensive, an innovative, a creative, and a proactive approach. It's good to know what a threat is, but we need to look into the future and be sure that we don't miss any opportunity to work on the newly identified risks, trends, and developments. Some takeaways, some, I would say, preliminary observations. This threat, this global threat, is certainly asking for a global response. The difference between what we used to do in earlier days and now is that we need for every single case a tailored, a bespoke approach. And that means that there is no such a thing as a one-size-fits-all, because if we strive for a one-size-fits-all, we will end up with a one-size-fits-no-one, and that will not lead us anywhere. Another thing is that we need definitely more partnerships, be it public-private partnerships, with the private sector, with the researchers, the think tanks, with the civil society. We need partnerships, be it at national level, at regional level, and at international level. Now, one thing we used to do, because our legislation, everything is bounded within the limits, the boundaries of a national territory, is to look at the local situation, at the national situation. If we tackle this global scourge at local and national level only, we will not get there. We need to tackle it at local, at national, at regional, and at international level. And of course, and last thing, takeaway is we talk about the weaponization of things, the weaponization of the internet, the weaponization of social media, the weaponization of artificial intelligence, the weaponization of drones. We have never heard about this. Using innocent things like a lorry, like a car, to tackle in an active shooting or in an active moment innocent people. We have had a whole set of these events all over the last decade. So weaponization of things. In other terms, the use of items for different, for bad, for criminal, and even for terrorist purposes. Now, what is the role of the organization I'm heading, CTED, Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate? Since many years, we do assess the Security Council resolutions implementation, the state of play of the security and counterterrorism measures in the 193 countries. And we verify everything throughout a dialogue. We look after the border management, security management at the borders, legislation, international judicial and law enforcement cooperation. We look at the national counterterrorism strategies, action plans, in what extent the financing of terrorism has been taken on board, the use of ICT for terrorist purposes have been taken on board, in what extent the member states are up and running in countering violent extremism, how they tackle radicalization in its earliest stage, online and offline, how they protect their soft targets, their critical infrastructure, how they deal with all kinds of trafficking, how they perceive their national risk on countering of violent extremism, how they perceive their risk of countering financing of terrorism. The whole set of events is being looked at. And the outcome is included in a report. I know that I'm always struggling with the microphone. I asked Stevie to get me a good microphone. I hope I'll reach you all. The assessments are, of course, meant to have an overview of the elements of the CT chain, and not only in one country, but in all the countries, and to ensure that once we have exchanged the recommendations with the member states, that they take care of the needed security gaps and take the CT measures in accordance with Security Council resolutions, in accordance with the conventions, the international standards and norms. But we also use these dialogues to come back with good practices, efficient practices. And the second role of CTED assessment analysis is to indeed verify the latest trends, developments, the lessons learned, the good practices. And there we lies with the research centers, the think tanks, the universities, to see in what extent our recommendations, in what extent our dialogue and trends we perceive during our dialogue can be coupled to good research, because good data, evidence-based research will certainly drive decision-making and policy decision-making. And last but not least, we offer expertise wherever and whatever is needed for, like in how to protect critical infrastructure, how to deal with the malicious use of drones, how to deal with the movement from the larger platforms to the smaller and startup platforms, or some of the expertises we have been working on. But let's now focus on a few, because we cannot tackle them all, on a few of those concerns, a few of those challenges we are facing for. And I just alluded to the foreign terrorist fighters. There is a landmark Security Council resolution that saw the daylight in December 2017, 2396, and that is calling for all the member states to take care of different measures. In a nutshell, and without taking too much risk of oversimplification of the area, which is extremely complex, we have been working on 18 guiding principles derived from different aspects of the Security Council resolution. And we have been discussing those with the member states, with all the member states, but also with the larger community, with the civil society, with the researchers, with the private sector, to be sure that what we are now promoting in the member states is going to be implemented systematically, going to be included in their policies, in their strategy. And it goes from, in fact, how to secure the borders in the 193 countries. There are huge differences between different countries. Some have done their homework, have implemented PNR, API, biometrics, databases, and are dealing with the watch lists, do this in total accord with legal frames, with the right cooperation with the private sector, in a total accord with human rights and the rule of law. But some have even not thought about having a minimum of API and a PNR, because they simply are struggling with getting the birth certificates being registered. So indeed, there are huge differences between the developed and the developing countries, and hence, again, as we stand for having a CT chain which is as strong as its weakest link, we have to remediate immediately, identify the loopholes in the system, and help those member states to get in tune with those new techniques that will help them to strengthen their elements in the CT chain. But that is even not enough. We also have to deal with counter-narratives and countering violent extremism. We have to deal with how to get proper prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, as we are more and more talking about the life cycle of a foreign terrorist fighter, never seen before. We have to start identifying the first signs of radicalization of violent extremism in the early stage, online, offline. Have to do this with a total multilateral, multidisciplinary approach, and have to make sure that we have a clear view on what is driving radicalization. What is radicalization to start with? What is violent extremism? And hence, there again, we need to identify all those drivers. We need to make sure that we analyze those factors leading to radicalization. And once we have identified and analyzed them, we need to use those disaggregated, quantitative data in order to have policy decision making. There are lots of initiatives that are taken in this context right now, but we are not there. The worst case scenario would be that we base our policy on assumptions. If we are faced with foreign terrorist fighters, females, we don't have to take care of any returning female because they're not a hardcore. We know for some reasons that females are the hardcore of the recruiters and of the insiders, because if they go back to their national original country, they don't have any future. We know that children have been taken care of by suicide, returning foreign terrorist fighters. Think about what happened in Indonesia in May last year. We know that men can be hardcore, but not per se be the hardcore. When we say that we are entering in the scene of violent extremist right wing, we tend to say that the radicalization is only happening online. Again, the worst thing we can do is base our decision-making on assumptions. We need evidence-based research, and hence we need to liaise with the research, and that's exactly what UNCTAD is doing. But also in relation to evidence, in all the investigations, prosecutions related to international terrorism, we see that digital evidence is utmost important, hard to get in a minimum of time. So-called battlefield evidence is another hard challenge, and international cooperation is something we pronounce with a lot of easiness, but it's hard to get when it comes to quick results, and that's exactly what we need to have. Protection of soft targets, how to protect, the Mayor has just alluded to it, how to protect our cities, our vulnerable places and cities, being aware that stadiums, theaters, that churches, that sports events have been tackled. Well, there again, we have organized different meetings to reunite all the players and the local authorities and the civil society and the private sector, because the Security Council resolution says explicitly that we need to strive and establish public-private partnerships at national, regional, and international level. The same goes for the protection of critical infrastructure, where we also need strategies and action plan. In other terms, if we look at different of those challenges, respective challenges, we need certainly have good dialogue. We need to have an overview of the good practices. We need to couple those findings based on the dialogue with the member states to research. We need evidence-based research. We need public-private partnership. We need regional partnerships. But we, of course, need multinationalism, multi-faceted, multidisciplinary approaches, and of course create awareness and training at the level of the experts. Foreign terrorist fighters, yes, it keeps us awake during night. If we don't take care of the returning, we don't have risk assessment tools based on evidence-based research, we might be confronted with the effect and the consequences of this in the next 10, 20 years, and have a fueling of radicalization because we didn't take care of this phenomenon in an expert way. The use of the internet, of new technologies. We will have at lunchtime a meeting with GRN. We are a true believer of this interaction. GRN is an initiative we took at CTAD in 2015, reuniting more than 100 institutes geographically spread all over the world. We're very proud to have ICT among our members. Well, this lunch will indeed be meant to see what are the new technologies, in what extent are we confronted with the misuse, the malicious use of the internet when it comes to the protection of critical infrastructure and soft targets. What about AI? What about drones? What about all those new techniques being used for terrorist purposes? I will conclude here by saying this is not the end of our story. We have put a lot of efforts in new Security Council resolutions. The two last are stemming from this year. March 2019, one on the financing of terrorism. We have to dig into the dialogue and the counter-terrorism measures, public-private partnership, the use of virtual money, the misuse of NPOs, and a lack of knowledge of the national risk on countering financing of terrorism are among the measures we need to take. And finally, nexus between organized crime and terrorism. Yes, not only to fund terrorism, not only transactional links, but also modus operandi being copied. When I visited one country recently in Africa, when the Minister of Finance told me that they had not any longer economy, but an informal a criminal economy, I started to say we need to do much more. That's exactly what this is about, joining the forces, thinking about what happens today, and being much better in doing what we have to do tomorrow. Thank you very much.